So you might be wondering, why would anyone write a whole book about growing up in Plymouth, New Hampshire? And it all started because about 8 or 9 years ago, we were going to be having, I was thinking ahead to having our 250th anniversary. And I thought it would be fun to write down what it had been like in the 50s and 60s. I hadn't actually committed to writing a book, but then I read something that made me think, I gotta do this. This is a quote from the author Susan Cheever, whose family has a house over near Newfoundland. And here's what she wrote in 2006 about Plymouth. Plymouth is a nice enough town, but it's not part of the blazing beauty of some sections of New Hampshire. It's too far south to be part of the White Mountains' gorgeous landscapes, and too far north to be part of New Hampshire's jewelry lake country. With its strip malls and fake clapboard stores on the way out of town, and its camping store and bakery and health food store with local produce in town, it's a town in the middle of nowhere. A town for people on the way to somewhere else. Well, you can imagine, that just got my blood boiling. So I said, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna write about what it was like to grow up in Plymouth. Okay. So we're actually going to start with a map from Mrs. Spear's book, 20 Decades in Plymouth, because it has a couple of things that I want to establish to begin with. All right, first of all, this was in 1905, but notice how small downtown is compared to the rest of Plymouth. And also notice that we had 2 railroad lines coming into Plymouth at that time, one from the west and one from the south. And until 1954, kids who came to the Plymouth schools from Warren or Wentworth or Rumney came in by train. And then after 1954, they were bused. This is how I like to think of Plymouth. This is a postcard from 1940. Plymouth Teachers College, the biggest thing in the middle of everything. You'll notice there's something called Dartmouth over there, something called New Hampshire University here, but hey, Plymouth is the center of it all. Now this is what Plymouth looked like. This is probably 1962. It's an aerial view. And here's Mary Lyon Hall. Notice all the trees, very green. This is Main Street. This is, I don't know if those were still tennis courts or if it had become a parking lot yet. Yeah. And here we are right now. And the thing about Plymouth at that time was that you could go from elementary school to junior high school, to high school, to college, and even get your master's degree, all within the space of one big block, which was really kind of great. These were some of the stores downtown in Plymouth at that time. Notice how almost all of them were, the names of the stores were the names of the owners. So we had Clay's newsstand. Is there a Clay here in the audience? There was Noise Insurance. This here was, I believe, Harris Brothers Furniture, which is now out on Teddy Mountain Highway. Here's Rand's, and here is Saliba's. Now, we don't have a Saliba's anymore, but where Dressers is now was Saliba's women's store. It's called the Style Center, right? And the men's store was just called Saliba's.
The furniture store used to be Adam's Supermarket.
Well, okay, but in this picture, Adam's Supermarket is right here.
Really?
Mm-hmm. And I think it moved a couple times.
Well, yeah.
So this sort of sets the scene for you about how things looked. Also, there were a lot more trees on the common back then. is Carl Adams, owner of Adams Supermarket. And all the guys that helped him, and look at the price of things then. And Carl was like the consummate Plymouth gentleman, merchant gentleman. He would grab your groceries, your bags of groceries, and walk you to your car. Just a wonderful guy. Okay, looking further down Main Street, further north from the Common, what's now Chase Street Market was called Volpe's, and it had fruit and vegetable fresh produce. What's now Cafe Altomano was Farley's Rexall drugstore. And not only did it have, you know, prescriptions and over-the-counter stuff, it had the best tuna fish sandwiches in the entire world. Okay. Yeah. Okay, now looking a little further north, I just want to finish off Main Street for you. The going down further, Samaha's store on the corner of Main Street and River Street looks like it does now, so I didn't have to show you a picture. Up here in 1962, way up on the left, would have been what was called then Silver Hall. And it was an auditorium and gymnasium, but nowhere near as big as the Silver Arts Center is now. Here's a building that is no longer here, but was very popular at the time. If you were at the Common and you turned south and looked to your right, you would see the Plymouth Inn. And actually, it didn't look like that. Somehow it looks like more square in the slide. It was wider, wasn't it? This was wider, I think, but anyway. The other reason I put this slide in was to show you this foreshortened, at least from where I'm standing, car, because it was my favorite car at the time. Please notice, it was two-toned. Now, I would have loved it all the more if it had been hot pink and white, or maybe turquoise and white. It had the forward look for the headlights, and the fins in the back, and it was a convertible. Well, I would say almost everybody's dream, and what my dad really wanted to drive, but people told him that it wasn't presidential. If you stood on the Common and looked away from Main Street, looked to the west, you'd see three iconic towers. You'd see Rounds Hall with its conning tower and clock. You'd see the Congregational Church as it was back then, with its beautiful details, and instead of what I think of as a steeple, it had a belfry, and then this gold leaf dome, really beautiful. And then next to that, Town Hall, which we still have, but at that time it was also the courthouse. This is the Congregational Church straight on. Look how classic it is. It was just a beautiful, beautiful building. This is where my dad went, and in addition to worship services up here, in the basement of the church, just like today, there were often activities and functions that were put on. My favorite activity, since I was raised Catholic, I didn't actually go to those services, but I did go to ballet lessons in the basement. And the ballet teacher was the son of the church secretary, a fellow by the name of Howard Murgatroyd, who was a wonderful ice skater and dancer and ended up as a professional dancer in New York City. And the highlight of my childhood ballet career, which was not very long because I was short, was when Howard Murgatroyd and our parents took all of us little girls down to the train station. We got on the Boston and Maine Railroad. We went to Boston and saw Swan Lake, put on by Sadler Wells, one of the premier dance companies in the world. And it was just so magical. All right. One of the other things that many of us kids liked, we had, special places, was a big tree. And this tree was called the Star King Elm. It was over 80 feet tall. It was down to just to the south of what's now the Plymouth Theater. What was the Plymouth Theater and is now the Flying Monkey. It towered over everything. And in order to see its height, for you to see its height, I'm going to pass around a book. On the page 81, there's a picture of the Star King Elm so you can see how tall it actually was. I forgot, Star King was a Unitarian minister and philosopher who loved to come to Plymouth and who liked to sit and lean against that tree and read. And so that was why it was named the Star King Elm. This tree actually started way below the sidewalk. And if you look carefully up in the left corner, you can see that there's a bit of sidewalk and a railing. That was supposed to keep us kids from climbing down to the trunk of the tree. As you can see, it didn't work. The tree was also very wide around. It was 24 feet, 4 inches in circumference, and just truly awesome. But then it died, it started dying of Dutch elm disease, so it was brought down. Another beautiful place when we were young was on Highland Street. It was called the PHS House, and it was a grand old hotel. It's where Lamson Library and PHS Hall are now. We used to love as kids to play on the lawn, to climb in the trees, to hide under the porches. It was just the best place. And that's one of the things that everybody seems to agree on that I have talked to about growing up in Plymouth, is that it felt very, very safe. And you didn't fear if your kid, if you lived down by the stores and your kid went up to play at the PHS House, well, that was just great. Even if they went into Langdon Park, that was okay too. Now, another thing about this hotel was it had a beautiful dining room. And this shows you the dining room and the view it had out over the mountains. Beautiful wallpaper and a very polished wooden floor that was sometimes used for dancing. And there's my dad, and there's my mom. And the rest of these people are Rotarians and their wives from all over New England. In fact, people felt so safe in Plymouth that they, at that time, for the most part, didn't even lock their doors. This is actually Dick Flanders' dad. And he is delivering Cushman's bakery products. Most likely, he's just going to walk into that house and put the bread in the bread box. And when the milkman comes, he'll do the same. He'll put the milk in the refrigerator. However, even though we felt really safe, and even though our doors weren't locked, we weren't totally at ease because of this. We knew, even as little kids, that there was this thing called the atom bomb, and that it was a scary thing, and that the adults were really concerned about it. As we were very little, they didn't tell us much about it, but we just knew it was kind of something everybody worried about. In 1952, we took off to elementary school. It's now the college administration building, but this and stage, okay? These were our teachers. And you might wonder, well, why do they say faculty as if these teachers were like in a college or something? And the reason is because they were. The Plymouth elementary schools were part of Plymouth Teachers College, or were run by Plymouth Teachers College. And the teachers would teach the aspiring ones, the ones at Plymouth Teachers College, all the newest methods of teaching and all the newest research. So these were not people that just taught little kids, although that's fine, that's really important. They taught, yeah, so what I heard someone say. Yeah, anyway, so there's one very special lady here. She made all of us feel just so welcomed, and she was very clear so we didn't get confused or worried. And that lady is in the back there. That's Mrs. Ella Batchelder. And she was the mother of Judge Bill Batchelder and the mother-in-law of Betty Batchelder, who has some funny stories to tell about that situation. Another favorite teacher was Miss O'Neill. Dee O'Neill. She had a great Irish wit. She loved to play the piano and get us to sing along. Jim Hogan, one of the social science professors at Plymouth, wrote in his book about Plymouth that she had discovered the discovery method of teaching before it was ever published, and I think that was true. Just quickly, Miss Rand, who a number of people have told me was so welcoming and sweet and kind. And Miss Miller, who I didn't have in school, but who, Ruth Miller, but who many of you knew from more recently. And we little girls really looked up to her because she was very pretty, and she also had the reddest hair, bright red hair. Well, here's some of their students. And as you can see, we dressed up in those days. Little girls did not wear slacks. In fact, I never wore slacks in any of the Plymouth schools. We also were clean and pressed. We even had little white ankle socks. And this was actually a birthday party. This was the side door to the president's house. Now there's one person I want you to kind of notice here. And I think she's here tonight, but I'm not sure. I'm looking around. It's this little girl here. She's awful shy, huh? Not really, but I don't know what was going on there, but you will be seeing more pictures of her. And her name was Susan Minicello, whose family owned Fausti's, which you can't see, the Fausti's sign is behind us, but a great restaurant in town. And it's now Susan Minicello Wigan. Here we are. We think it's first grade, but it might be third grade.
It's first.
First, okay. And again, we have some people that you know. There's Susie, smiling here. There's Linda Bartley. There's me, and I don't know what was going on, but I didn't look happy. There's Dick Flanders. There's the late John Noyes. Joan Mackenzie. Anyway, that's not you, Bruce, is it? Okay. But notice, and this was true for the whole time period, the boys got to wear like blue jeans and t-shirts and get dirty. But the girls, I mean, we didn't look, as crisp as at the party, but the girls always had to have their skirts on and be neat. One of our favorite seasons was winter because of all the fun you could have in the snow. And this particular picture is probably from the 1940s, but I just wanted you to see how there were all these different ski trails. It says 10 ski trails in Plymouth. And until World War II, Plymouth was really a destination ski area. And people would come on ski trains up to Plymouth. And then after the war, that kind of petered out, but it was still a ski town. One of the favorite places we little kids liked to ski was in my backyard. This is the president's house from the back. This was a fence that contained inside it beautiful gardens that we had then. And then this, which is now a parking lot, was called Bunny Hill. And people, even adults, would practice their skiing there. We'd get lessons there. We'd take saucers, those aluminum saucers, down there. And it eventually got the name Hyde Hill, I guess because we lived there so long, that, that's what it became. For more excitement and drama, you could go south to Mount Frontenac, the southern edge of town. It had 6 ski trails and a terrifying rope tow. And then the biggest and most fun thing, other than obviously going to Cannon or something, was to go to Waterville Valley. As you can see, it's not your parents' or grandparents' Waterville Valley. I mean, it is your parents' Waterville Valley. It's not like today. This was the only ski slope. There were several slopes, but this was the only ski mountain, Snows Mountain. And then there was a wonderful Waterville Inn that was great for parties and all kinds of things. Unfortunately, it burned in 1967. Plymouth was well known for its winter carnivals. And this needs a little explanation. You know how there's a Kentucky Colonel, as the mascot of Kentucky? And you can go there and they'll give you like a glass with a Colonel on it or whatever. Well, someone, I don't know who, thought that New Hampshire needed a mascot. But rather than a Colonel, they came up with a whooper. As you can imagine, it didn't last very long. So this is the only picture I have of a New Hampshire whooper. But at any rate, there's the big sign for the Plymouth Winter Carnival, and we'll show you more of this in a minute. We have wonderful snow sculptures at the carnival. This one says, which came first, with the chicken and the broken egg. And this one says, and it's in front of Mary Lyon Hall, favorite teacher, with the little kid and the teacher. And all the different organizations in town would get involved, the churches, the clubs, the college, the high school. It was really fun. This was the queen you saw in the other picture. She's finally got her crown. And it's the entire court, the 2 princesses, and then I guess, I don't know what they were called, but they were also in the court. Notice the dress. Notice you could wear pants when you went skiing. You were allowed to do that. But they aren't the kind of pants you think of today. They were these really kind of baggy gabardine things. The old-fashioned ski sweaters. And then, I don't know why, but they brought a bunch of us kids in to this particular winter carnival and had us sit there for the photograph. Now, if you're beginning to think that I show up in a lot of pictures, which is what Dick Flanders accuses me of. Okay, I do, but I just want to point out, there's Dick. There's Susie. And I think that's John. Now here, looking very sleepy, is John Pettingill, who will grow up to become the captain of the Mount Washington on Lake Winnipesaukee. And I trust he never looked like that when he was running a boat. Eventually winter left and you got mud season. And if you lived way downtown or on River Street, you would get floods and it would be horrible. But for some of us kids, if we lived further up so the mud didn't bother us so much, we loved mud season because you could finally get your bikes out and ride all over town. And you could get out your roller skates. Now these aren't the kind of roller skates we have today. These were our roller skates. Okay. Another aspect of spring in Plymouth was beautiful gardens and flowering trees everywhere. And this was a sunken garden that is to the left of Mary Lyon Hall on the big lawn. Today, the building behind it is called Heritage Commons, but it was Lamson, the original Lamson Library. And this was quite large, had beautiful flowers and stepping stones, and was developed and built by Professor Robert Boyd, for whom Boyd Hall, the Science Center, is now named. And he not only did this beautiful pond, second garden, he also did Langdon Park, I mean, with a lot of help. And he did a lot of other gardens and so on campus. One of our absolutely favorite things, of course, about spring were the lilacs, which in fact are just blooming now outside of the building here. And Linda Morse Barlick reminds me that we used to love to take big bouquets of lilacs to our teachers. But the thing was, we weren't real careful about where we got them. So we would just walk along and pick lilacs. But it didn't seem that bad because everybody had so many lilacs, and no one ever actually told us we shouldn't do it. Well, with spring comes Easter, and I thought you might like to see some Easter fashions. This is my mom and me getting ready to go down to St. Matthew's Church, which is at the end of the President's House driveway. And I have some of the fashions of the day on. I have little saddle shoes, a little Easter basket, and probably a new coat and an Easter bonnet. Mom, very fashionable in her peak-toe shoes, her early 50s suit, and then this thing, which I absolutely hated. This was very fashionable back then. It was a scarf made of like muskrat or mink pelts. And that would have been okay, but they left the head on and the little feet. In June of 1955, one of our most memorable historic events happened. We all liked Ike. Many of us loved Ike, and Ike came to town. He was on his way to go fishing and golfing up way north. And he was convinced by Sherman Adams and Senator Norris Cotton to stop in Plymouth and cut the ribbon to inaugurate the new Plymouth Guarantee Savings Bank. He was great. The whole town came out. He was a real politician. He held babies. He kissed a lot of people. He kissed me. I did not wash my face, or actually the right side of my face, for about 5 days after I kissed him. In 1957, we went off to the middle school, but it wasn't really called a middle school, it was called the Memorial School. And again, it was part of the demonstration school system of the college and the town. And 5th and 6th grades were here, 7th and 8th were here. Now, something happened in November of 1957 that caused a giant reform in American education. Does anyone know what happened? Sputnik. Okay. This was what happened. The Russians got ahead of us in space. They got this little satellite up before we got our satellites up. Even more worrying was their satellite was orbiting over us. The Congress sprang into action. People said, why can't Johnny read? Why can't Johnny do math? Why can't Johnny do science? And why can't we beat the Russians? And so they began to pour money and ideas into education. And there was a whole bunch of legislation called the National Defense Education Act, which paid for teachers to get more upgrades to their education, for new language labs, for new science labs. But the thing was, it wasn't just science and math. We had to beat the Soviets at everything.
So they also wanted us to be good at social studies. They wanted us to be able to convince all the new nations that were arising after World War II to like our way of life. So we had to get better in everything. And these were the people that were going to do it. They're going to help us do it. Now, isn't it interesting that of our middle school teachers, shown here, 3 of them got their doctorates and became professors at the college. This was Mary Sanderson, who became Dr. Sanderson and taught anthropology, Dr. Marr, he became, and Dr. Fry. Okay. And they really worked hard to get us competitive with the Russians. They also had to teach us how to be safe in case those Russians sent a bomb over. So we had to learn to duck and cover. There we are, ducking and covering. I actually believed that was going to help. Some families also had air raid shelters. And my mom told me that the storeroom in the basement of the president's house that had a lot of tuna fish and canned beans and for some reason maraschino cherries, I don't know why, that was going to be our fallout shelter. It wasn't until I got into high school and did a science project that I learned if your fallout shelter wasn't lined with lead, it wasn't any good. But we did have fun too. This was Mary Lyon, there were bowling alleys in the bottom of Mary Lyon Hall. There were also bowling alleys at the railroad station. And of course, there were wonderful bowling alleys over in Holderness on Little Squam, Louis Francesco's bowling alleys. Another thing that we did in the middle grades was a lot of marching and singing and playing instruments. This was the Royal Eagles marching band and drum corps. This was the only picture I could find of one of these, but before them, there was a group called the Little Steppers. And we loved to be out in parades, you know, showing off and doing all this kind of stuff. We also loved to go to college plays. There was an organization called the Plymouth Players who were college students who did wonderful plays in Silver Hall. And they did everything from Shakespeare, this is The Merry Wives of Windsor, to more modern plays like The Crucible by Arthur Miller. And many of us little kids really got the acting bug from looking at these plays, and also the whole town would get involved in finding props, designing and sewing costumes. It was really kind of an all-town effort, kind of like that we have today, although on a much smaller scale. When we weren't outside, we might be found inside watching TV, which remember was very new then. And one of our favorites was the Mickey Mouse Club with the Mouseketeers. There's Annette, and I think that's Doreen. Okay, and so that was another thing we did. We also watched lots of situation comedies, and this was Father Knows Best. But in addition to kind of light comedy shows like this, there were lots and lots of Westerns. In fact, I think probably half the shows on TV were Westerns. And I grew up thinking that the only acceptable man in the world had to have a square jaw, ride a horse, and wear a white hat. Another thing we liked to do was to go out to eat with our families. And this was a place called the Open Gate, which was on Highland Street, where Plymouth Professional Place is now. And they had cabins and also a nice dining room. This is a terrible photo of a wonderful place, Teacher's Clam Bar. It was north of town. It was owned by our high school principal, George Zulius, and Bruce Ryan, a guidance counselor. And in the summer, teachers worked there, as did students. and it had incredibly good fried clams. To the west of town, we actually had our very own French restaurant. This was, you can see the kind of ruins of this out there now, but this was on the Mayhew Turnpike. And this was called the Welcome Inn. The owners were, and the chef was French. Every year they would go back to France for a short time. And that's where I learned to order things like pommes frites, coco vin, and mousse au chocolat. And it was just the greatest place. Sometimes you just stayed home and had TV dinners. And this one looks very appetizing, but it's missing one thing, which is the dessert. And often there was a compartment for apple crisp or cherry cobbler. And many of us tried to eat dessert first, particularly since sometimes your parents weren't home when you had your TV dinner. But it was so hot that if you tried to eat it first, you'd burn your mouth. In our final year in 8th grade, the country went through a big campaign. And it was Richard Nixon versus John F. Kennedy. This is on the west side of the Common. This was the campaign headquarters for President Nixon. The Kennedys, being a little bit closer, managed to send up one of their prize speakers. This was Rose Kennedy, who came and spoke in town on behalf of her son. And, of course, he won. And for many of us, this was very exciting to have such a young and handsome couple leading the nation, and very inspirational. We then went off to high school during Kennedy's first year in office, and this picture does not include, over on the side, was a vocational building also connected to the high school. There were basically 3 kind of tracks, but they weren't really locked in. You could take a general course, which meant a little bit of everything. You could take college bound, which meant what you would need to get into college, and that at the time included Latin. Or you could take business and secretarial, which was if you wanted to, basically if you wanted to become a secretary or an assistant. Our social studies teachers, and I have to focus on them because I was one, really stressed to us some lines from JFK's inaugural. Everybody knows the first line, which is, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. But what is often forgotten was the next paragraph. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. And this was just very inspiring to us. And Plymouth got very international. One of the leaders in this was Professor James Hogan, who taught his students who were going to be teachers, all about different parts of the world. He was sent by the State Department to Egypt, and then later I think to Tanzania. And my dad was sent to Germany, and then later to Nepal. It was all part of this, we're going to get to know the world, we're going to convince the people of the world that America is a great place. And then educators and students would come from other countries. We had exchange students from Turkey, and we had Batuk Rajbandari, who was a kind of student administrator from Nepal. I got ahead of myself. So clearly, helping foreign countries was important. However, we had a big shock in April of 1961. Remember how the Soviets got Sputnik up first? Well, they got a man in space first, too. Yuri Gagarin, who we hadn't thought that they were as far ahead as they were. And so the word from Cape Canaveral was, so close yet so far, US had hoped for its own launch. Once again, we seem to be behind. But somebody from New Hampshire saved the day. This was a display honoring Alan Shepard, who was the first American in space, but he didn't orbit. And John Glenn, who after 11 tries was finally sent into space and orbited. You might notice that the room looks familiar. You might notice Daniel Webster here and Daniel Webster there. The reason is that this building was our town library until Pease Library was built. And all of us, this was where we went and looked stuff up and did our homework. Now, if it wasn't enough that we had to worry about astronauts, but in October of 1962, many of us were absolutely terrified because at that time, it seemed like there might actually really be a nuclear war. The word came that the Soviets had put offensive missiles in Cuba, and JFK and Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union were like staring at each other. One of them said it was like two scorpions in a bottle, and knowing that if one struck, they'd actually both end up dead. Luckily, calmer heads prevailed, and in exchange for us promising not to invade Cuba, the Soviets took their missiles out. It turned out we promised a few other things, but to save face for both sides, not all of the deals that were made were announced at that time. Okay, so, we have to worry about the Soviets, we have to worry about the bombs, but there was another worry. We were terrified, well, not all of us, but many of us, were terrified that we might be invaded by space aliens. And there were many movies and books around trying to convince us that this could happen. So, one of the most popular was called Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and the idea was that they would beam down, they would get into someone's body, eliminate its brain, like my husband Bert. I think he's my husband Bert, but oh my God, he's not Bert anymore, okay? He's a space alien, and he's gonna take over the world. All right, that was scary, but there was an actual kind of philosophy that was very strong in this country that was like this, but it applied to communists, not space aliens. And the idea was that somehow the communists were going to invade the minds of the youth of America. Now, how are the communists going to invade our minds? Well, one of their biggest tools, even if he didn't know it, was Elvis Presley. Because he was going to break down our characters with his rotating pelvis and that jungle beat music. And even worse than Elvis would be, say, someone who played rhythm and blues. Whoa, that was really scary. And really, youth of America shouldn't listen to this stuff. And seriously, there were quite a few people who thought that. Okay, so maybe Elvis was a little much, but would you think that Rotarians would be communist tools? By the way, there's Judge William Batchelder. There's Carl Adams, now with white hair. There's my dad, there's Bob Rand, and Watt Rand, and a whole lot of other people. Now, how could these people possibly be communists? Because they supported a thing called the Model United Nations at Plymouth Teachers College. And the Model United Nations, according to William Loeb, the publisher of the Manchester Union Leader, was a breeding ground for communists and nefarious characters. The Model United Nations took high school kids from Quebec, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and gave each school randomly a different country, and we all came together one long weekend and basically acted out, role-played the very dilemmas that were being dealt with in the real United Nations. one year after Khrushchev had taken off his shoe and beaten it on the podium of the real United Nations, the delegates from Russia at our model UN did the same thing. There was a real disagreement about how do we deal with the Soviets? Do we try to make peace with them, or do we really have to just push them back? So on Route 3, between Plymouth and Ashland, there arose a cemetery of captive nations. And it had all the different Soviet satellites as part of it. Now, these folks didn't want to just hold communism back, contain it. They wanted to roll it back. And so, help liberate the captive nations, save America, wake up America, or this will be your fate, live free or die. So that's kind of the extremes of the thinking that we were getting as young kids and high school students, between rolling back the Soviets and trying to make peace with the Soviets. One thing that pretty much brought everybody together, of course, was in the fall of 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated. The kids in my class learned about it in a high school assembly that was called on the Friday afternoon that he was killed. I was homesick that day and happened to be watching TV, so I learned about it from Walter Cronkite, who almost started crying when he announced President Kennedy is dead. He died at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. And people were devastated. A lot of services and parades and memorial services in Plymouth for Kennedy. Even people, Plymouth was pretty much Republican then, but it didn't matter. I mean, it was really horrible that this man was cut down in such a young age. But we went back to normal life eventually, and I want to show you a few of the high school activities. So this was our famous Bobcat football squad. This was the squad for 1964, and there were two guys here that I just have to point out because they were the heartthrobs of the girls of the class of 1965, at least most of us. Here was Sonny Gore, number 40, and here was Jimmy Roberts, number 20.
That's all?
There's more heartthrobs, but we don't have time for them. Okay, remember that playing football then was very different from the games that they have now up in the new Plymouth High School. We didn't have a field near the school. So we would march from the high school down over the bridge to D&M Field. And there were some kind of ratty looking bleachers, but they didn't hold everybody, so a lot of people stood. And then over the fence on the other side of the field, there was another audience. They were the cows. There was a farmer's field there, and the cows loved to watch the game. The cheerleaders, as you can see, were in their winter uniforms, kind of warmer. And if our guys won, it was very exciting because a police car would lead us all back up into town, around the common, and the football players were all given free ice cream sundaes by Mr. Kennedy at Geyer's drugstore. These are the cheerleaders for basketball for 1965. And, well, there's Susie again. But I gotta say, there's me. And then remember how you had those little kids, particularly the girls, looking up to the carnival queens? Class of 65, our carnival beauty queen, Mary Ellen Morris, Devaney, and our carnival popularity queen, Anne-Marie Miller. It didn't seem possible, but we've gotten to be so old that we were part of what we had looked up to when we were littler. Another thing we loved to do was dance. We loved to dance to rock and roll. We loved Elvis. And we had canteen every Friday night, which was a big dance in the Spear Gym with a student DJ. Parents and some teachers would chaperone, but they weren't real vigilant. And unfortunately, this is not canteen. I couldn't find a picture of canteen, so this is just meant to kind of represent it. I think it's a college dance. But there were two other things about these dances. One was that afterwards, we always would go down to Fausti's and have hot fudge sundaes and all kinds of other good stuff. And French fries, right, great French fries. And also, we all wished, but I don't think it ever happened, that our favorite local band, the Crossfires, would play there. They were very popular all over New Hampshire. They were 3 Plymouth high school guys and 1 guy that they met at UNH. And they had their own album, Limbo Rock, and we loved them. And guess what?
We're all here.
The 3 remaining Crossfires are all here tonight.
I grew up in a White House, but my White House was never finished. My dad, she showed a few photos here, as a door-to-door bread salesman. He struggled, he worked, put every cent he got into the house, so when we moved into it, there was no sheetrock in the walls and so on. And so we didn't have a lot of money. In fact, the family car was that bread truck that you saw. So that meant that we couldn't be hanging around after school, taking advantage of some of the events and programs. We had to get back in the bus to get back home again. So which meant what? We were all bummed out? No, we didn't know any different. That's just our life. We learned, like Bruce and others here, to go learn how to hunt, shoot woodchucks, eventually things like deer, things like that. You know, things that we learned to take care of. We had fun in the woods, basically. And I built a camp in high school and then expanded it, made a 2-story addition in college. And we learned how to do such things as, live off the land, drink, and all sorts of things that my folks didn't mind us doing because they knew we were safe, I guess, in the backyard. So anyway, our experience growing up, surprising I ever got to college, given that I didn't have the same kind of experiences that Mary Ann had. I didn't hang out downtown. I wasn't good at assimilating with the other kids. Everybody thought I was stuck up, when in fact I was just super shy. And I think it is all about your upbringing and what the perception is of your classmates and so on. But I got into a program like Team LA. Anybody ever heard of Team LA? Yeah, Rainbow Girls, even better. Yeah. So that was where I got involved with actually socializing with my peers and talking in public, that kind of thing. And it was just a different way of growing up, as it were. I learned to speak in public and didn't seem to mind it so much. But anyway, my experience is one of somebody living on a major highway, Fairgrounds Road. But there's others here that lived even further out in the boonies in Plymouth that I'd like to hear from tonight. One of the people I'm thinking of is one of our own Crossfires members, Roger. Roger lived out in New Hebron Road. Probably never even heard of New Hebron Road. Well, he didn't even get the benefit, I don't think, of a bus. Didn't you have to get a ride from somebody in a car or something?
Horse and buggy. Yeah. Old Hebron Road, that old. Not even.
Anyway.
Roger, before you say anything, could the other 2 Crossfires stand up just so we can give them all a good round of applause? Where are you? No?
Come on, Denny.
Come on.
You can stay.
These guys were our heroes.
Okay, we didn't bring our instruments tonight, so this is just going to be the vocal event. First of all, I'd like to explain my Plymouth credentials. Back in 1947, my parents and our 3 kids left a comfortable suburban house in Hempstead, New York, on Long Island, New York. And we moved to Old Hebron Road, to the Old Town Farm on Old Hebron Road. And at that time, my father had just got some electricity installed into the house, but there was no plumbing. And as a matter of fact, there was no plumbing for about a year after we moved into the house. But we did have this beautiful two-holer out in the back of the woodshed. And on the door, my father put a sign that said pointers and setters, just to make sure that everybody hit the right hole. My folks wanted to have a chicken farm up there on the Old Town Farm. And that didn't work out because the water supply on the farm wasn't adequate to support a fairly large operation like that. So we kind of transitioned into more of a subsistence farm where we had a cow for milk and we had chickens for eggs and we had some pigs that we slaughtered for meat, and my father had all kinds of like ducks and turkeys through the first 3-4 years that we were there. And cats and dogs, all the things that you'd expect to find on a farm like that. We were only 4 miles out of town, so that we had access to the town. And I always considered that we had the best of both worlds. We had the access to the town, but we had the excitement and the adventure of living on a farm. And of course, that was a big thing to us kids, having just left like the suburbs of Hempstead, which was basically just very close to New York City. So here we are on Old Hebron Road and 4 miles from town, and you were talking about getting into town, Dick, with the bus and not being able to get into town on the bread truck. We had one car, and we were able to get into town once in a while. We could always walk into town. Of course, it's 4 miles. It would take you about an hour and a half to walk into town. During the summertime, you could make it a lot quicker because you had all these mosquitoes and deer flies and black flies, and you were moving a lot faster. You could always take the bike, and I say the bike because we only had one bike between the 3 kids, and that was my sister's bike. So my brother and I weren't too crazy about riding a girl's bike around. The ride into town was fairly enjoyable. It was mostly downhill. But the ride back home was not such a great pleasure because most of the time you're just walking along pushing the bike. So that's the way it was, and we had a good time. We were always outside. We were always having different adventures on the farm and so on. We had a school bus that took us to school and brought us home, but it wasn't a big yellow bus. It was a Ford station wagon with a wooden sides, and it was operated and owned by Ken Jennis, and he had a contract with the school district to provide bus service for us kids in that area. There were only about 3 or 4 of us from time to time, and we rode that bus. And Ken was a great storyteller. I used to love to listen to his stories because he lived in that area up there in Plymouth Mountain or Bridgewater Mountain all his life. And he had these super stories about his upbringing and his experiences up there, about the bears and the hunting and so on and so forth. And I was always fascinated, but he'd be driving the car and he'd have this Lucky Strike cigarette between his fingers. And I was always fascinated how he could balance that ash on the end of that cigarette. He could get about an inch and a half of ash before it finally fell into his lap. So that was pretty fascinating. Dick just reminded me that since the chicken farm didn't pan out, both of my folks went to work and had regular jobs. My mother, her first job was with the Toby Lumber Company here in town, 2 buildings away from here and upstairs. And then she went to work for the Air Insurance Company. She was a secretary and had some accounting skills as well. And then she was fortunate enough to land a job up at the Plymouth Teachers College at the administration building. And she worked her way up through various positions in the administration building until she was finally hired by Dr. Hyde as Dr. Hyde's secretary. So my mother was Mary Ann's father's secretary for many years at the college, and she retired, I think, in 1973 or 74. So, like just to summarize, our position up there on the old town farm, Old Hebron Road, was the best of both worlds. We could get into town and we could enjoy all the most of the activities and so on, having to do with the school and the town, but we also had the adventure and the unique aspect of growing up on a farm, and there was a lot of history too involved with the town farm and the property around it. Now I'd like to switch gears and talk a little bit about the crossfires. The crossfires started back at UNH in 1960. In 1960, I somehow got into UNH and went down there in September and went into Fairchild Hall to meet my roommate, who I'd never met before and hadn't have any idea who it would be. And lo and behold, it was Dave Kent. And along with his notebooks and pencils and clothing and somebody that he brought to college, he also brought with him an electric guitar and amplifier. And when I saw that, I said, wow, and I think we're going to have something in common here. Because I had an old acoustic guitar that my grandfather gave me back when I was about 10 years old. I never really knew how to play it well. I'd pluck out a few tunes here and there. But Dave had an electric guitar, and he knew how to play chords, which are really the basis for all guitar music. If you don't know chords, you probably can't play a guitar. And Dave taught me how to play chords on the guitar. So over the first few weeks that we were there, and I got my guitar down, I bought a little electric pickup for it and put it on there, and pretty soon we were having little jam sessions in our room at Fairchild Hall. And people would come down and they kind of enjoy it. And as time progressed through the year, we kind of upgraded our equipment a little bit, and we both joined the same fraternity, Sigma Beta, at UNH. And in our sophomore year, we started giving serious consideration to maybe starting a band. But we needed a couple other guys. And I told Dave, I said, I know a couple of guys from Plymouth High School. They were classmates, but they're 1 year behind me. And I said, they used to be in a band called the Swingin' Bobcats?
Swingin' Bobcats.
The Swingin' Bobcats. And I said, their name is Denny Day and Les Philbrick. Les Philbrick's a great guitar player, and Denny's a great drummer. And he said, well, check them out. So I think it was a spring break, my sophomore year. Saw Denny right out here. He was right out there by the parking lot. And really. And I said, hey. I said, hey, Denny, how about, I said, my roommate and I have a think about starting a band up down UNH. I said, I think you and Les might be interested in trying out and see if you might want to play. And I think he looked at me as kind of like, you playing a band? He never knew I had anything to do with music. But anyway, we got together for the first time in Denny's mother's living room on Pleasant Street.
Yeah.
And we had our first jam session, and it turned out pretty good. Les Philbrick, who passed away in 1995 due to an untimely illness, he was a very gifted guitar player. He never had any formal lessons, but he was one of these people, like maybe Eric Clapton or somebody, that just really knew how to play the guitar almost intuitively. And Denny always kept a real strong beat on the drums, and he would eventually become our lead vocalist for the group. And Dave was started out with a regular guitar, but he graduated to a bass guitar because we needed that good pounding beat for the bottom for a sound. And Dave also became our manager. And Dave is really responsible for the success of the band because he promoted the band. He went out and he got the jobs all over New England for us. And most of the money that we put in our pockets, and it was quite considerable for that particular time period, Dave is mostly responsible for that because of his business acumen. So one of the big accomplishments, I guess, of the Crossfires was the fact that where's that number rocket? Here. Is that in 1962, I think it was in 1962, the latter part of the year, Dave took the initiative to go to Manchester and look up a representative for Strand Record, which is a label that was producing records back then. It's no longer in existence. And Dave approached this fellow by the name of Jim Parks. He said, we've got a good band, we'd like to make a record. And they negotiated a bit, and Jim Parks says, well, if you want to make a record, it's got to be a little rock type music. And we said, yeah, we don't Chubby Checker was big. Remember Chubby Checker and the Limbo Rock? He was big back and then, so we got stuck making a Limbo Rock album. And what we did is we composed 10 songs by ourselves. The group composed 10 songs, and then we utilized 2 cover songs. One of them was Limbo Rock, and the other one was Jamaica Farewell, for a total of 12 songs on the album. And we had Strand Records make the album for us. We had a deal with Strand Records where we would distribute, the Crossfires would distribute the album in New Hampshire exclusively, and Strand Records would distribute the album over the rest of the country. So for the next few months we were out peddling records as well as the regular gigs and so on. And the big value of the record was not putting money into our pocket from royalties or anything like that, but it was to say that we were Strand recording artists. That's the way.
Dave.
Oh, here we go.
Just like the old days.
Denny hasn't changed at all. Well, I can remember a couple of things, but I think one thing that sticks in my mind the most, first of all, we never missed a job. All over New England, we never missed a job, we were never late for a job. And we were through the middle of the winter or whatever. We worked at Hanover an awful lot, we worked here in Plymouth, we worked in Durham. We were pretty busy.
Country Bell, don't forget. Country Bell.
Country Bell down on Route 3 South. You could work your way through college back then, and that was the best part of it. I mean, you actually supported yourself, and you really can't do that now, I don't believe, unless you're highly successful. And we were pretty successful. It was kind of fun. We had one job up here over in Spear, in the basement of Spear, in the gymnasium. And we were playing along, and we had a pretty good time. It was going pretty well, and the kids were, they're getting a little lively. So we took a break. We went out front, and this guy with slick back hair and a suit jacket comes up to me and said, I want you to turn that down. Well, I didn't know Harold Hyde. So Roger comes over, you know who that is? I said, no, I have no idea. That's Harold Hyde. So, that's a big deal. So we went on and finished the night, and everything was fine. Now here's the real kicker. That guy hired me a few years later to be a teacher up here. And he never realized who I was. And I never knew whether it was his secretary, Berta, Roger's mom, or Harold, who took my talk and said, oh, I guess I'll hire this guy. But it worked out really well because he had a wonderful career at the college, and that was terrific too. Here you go, Danny.
Yeah, I'm from Plymouth. Grew up in Plymouth, born in the old hospital, and went to Plymouth High School. We had the old high school band that was Les Sturrock and John Noseworthy and myself were the swinging Bobcats. And I can remember one summer we played up at the Jacqueline, and we played there all summer, and we were getting $15. And we split it 3 ways. And we thought that was pretty good cash. And then we moved on, and of course we got together with the Crossfires, and that was a lot of fun. Mary Ann had a little crush on somebody in the Crossfires. That's what you told me. It's just between her and me.
Thanks.
Yes, I'm glad to know.
And that's singular, thank you. And I don't really have too much to say, just was...
You did a lot of work in like announcing Plymouth Fair stuff. Remember all those years?
Oh yes, yes. Some of the other part was I was with the Buddy Wagner's Lucky Mustang Hell Drivers at the fair, and there was 5 of us one time, all from Plymouth. There was me, Denny Devon, Bobby Connors, Carl Hartz, and Jimmy Flanders was the clown. And of course, I couldn't have, when I was announcing, I couldn't have everybody from Plymouth, New Hampshire, and from Plymouth, New Hampshire. So I made up some good names, like Carl Hartz was from the Mile High City of Denver, Colorado. And Bobby Connors was the smiling Irishman from Boston, Massachusetts. And I had everybody had a different thing just because it made more sense to do it that way. And I was with them for about 4 years. And then I got done, and then I got a call in '72 from a show out in Buffalo, New York, and they came out with a new stunt. They went up a ramp and did a 360 and landed on a receiving ramp. And they'd already been down in Texas, down to the Astrodome, and they didn't like their announcer. So I got a call, and I go, no, I don't. I've done that, been there. So he kept feeding the old things out, and I go, well, maybe I could come down and do a couple of shows. So I got there, and I ended up staying the whole season with them. So that was a lot of fun.
Tell us your favorite joke when you were before the fair.
One of the favorite jokes? Well, I liked one that Crash was the clown, of course. And I said, geez, Crash, I heard that Dolly Parton's here this evening, going to catch the show. He goes, yeah, that's right. She's sitting way up there in the back of the stands. He goes, I'm going to go up and see her. Well, go right up, Crash. I'm sure she'd like to meet you. So up into the stands he goes, and there he goes, and he's talking, and he comes back down, and he said, well, that must have been kind of exciting meeting Dolly Parton. He says, it wasn't her. It wasn't her? I said, well, who was it? He says, it was two bone and sat next to each other.
People don't realize that you used to have a store on Main Street. What'd you sell?
Oh yes. Along the way I had a store on Main Street, and it was called the Shoe Rack.
Oh yeah.
I talked to somebody that said that they still have those shoes today. Bobby Connors. I don't know if you remember Bobby Connors, but I talked to him and he said he still has them. And I told him I should have gotten more money for them back then. Yeah, I had the Shoe Rack, and I had a real estate office on Tenny Mountain Highway, Sundance Realty. I was out there for a few years. And I did construction in Waterville Valley with Bill Cantlin. We built a bunch of condos up there. And I had a lot of bands over the years. If it had a bar in it, we were probably there. And unfortunately, they were buying the drinks for the band.
How about Toby's Motor Court?
Toby's, been to Toby's, yeah. Yeah, that used to be kind of a wild little place. We played there, I don't know, we used to play some of these places for Toby's. I think we were there like a year and a half before we finally got out and went somewhere else and came back.
White Hat.
And the White Hat, yeah, we played the White Hat and played the, geez, what was that? Days End, but it wasn't that then, it was Holiday Inn. We used to play up there. I know we played with Holiday Inn even. And we played all winter, so we were getting ready to leave, and the guy says, where are you going? I said, well, I'm going to be going down the White Hat, down to Holderness for the summer. He goes, you can't do that. I don't have my bands play other places right in the area. I said, well, this band does. I said, if you want them back, I'll tell you in the fall, and you can tell me if you want me back. If not, too bad. And we went back and played another winter there, so I guess it worked out.
Thank you, Danny.
And thank you very much.
I did want to mention one thing. For those of you that are really fans of the Crossfires, Roger Close put together a history of the Crossfires that if you're interested in, he indicated he'd be willing to email you. So talk to Roger after. We have a copy in our file, because I made it myself, in our historical, you're already in our historical files, all of it. And we appreciate that. But we want to give a few opportunities here before we break for those other people here that might have questions of Mary Ann. Mary Ann, come up here. And what you might want to say to her or offer her or whatever. Anybody? Want the mic?
Oh, no, don't ask about the boyfriend or girlfriend.
Can you hear me all right?
Can I hear you all right? Yeah.
No, you were talking about typing in high school,
Yes.
and I was the class of 1961,
Yes.
and I took typing for 2 years.
You did, then Dick must have told me wrong.
Exactly. I did not know that. I didn't see you in class.
That's right.
You took it too. There's 2 people in the back here.
Yeah, and I talked to another guy, Dale Chellis.
Yep.
Okay.
I talked him into taking it too, because I was going to be the only guy in there.
You notice Dick wasn't bothered by being the only guy. Okay, so correction and a good reminder to not ever take just one source for information. Any other questions?
Other questions, comments, or whatever? If not, we thank you. Oh, yeah, way in the back there.
Yes, we used to wait for your father to come and bring those donuts.
Good, good. I still have some. Go ahead.
I can stand up, but when we came here in 1966 to sign a contract, and we went by D&M Park where they have the fence that was rotten and fallen down had a 4-letter word which began with S, and it was of this size. And my wife looked at me and said, "How long are we going in here?" And I turned to her and said, 2 years. The longest 2 years. 52 years. 52. Yeah, you came to me.
We moved here in '71 when Paul started teaching here, and I was a volunteer at the school, and our son was in kindergarten, our daughter was in 3rd grade, and I started working at the guidance office because they needed a part-time person, and that was perfect for me. And that spring, first of all, one of the very, very best student was Paul Richardson, and he went to the school in Vermont, the medical school in Vermont, I remember that. But the other thing I remember was that one of the girls wanted to take shop, and I was told by Parr, was it Ed Parr, the guidance counselor?
Ed Parr was
Ed Parr?
yeah.
Yes, okay, and he says, no, girls can't take shop. I was so incensed. I put her name in there, I didn't take it out, and I figured they could kick her out, but I was going to put her in there. I don't remember whether she could take it or not.
Thank you. Go ahead. You want to add?
Yes. Why we came here? We left Cuba in 1960, escaping the mess. But we never came to stay, because we could not believe that from here we could not do something to take that madman out. What you don't know is that when the missile crisis, we were in Washington, D.C., he was teaching at a prep school, biding our time.
Learning English.
Practicing the English. Anyways, we were in Washington, missile crisis comes, and there is President Kennedy speaking. And he turns to me, and I'm going to write a book and call it Throw All the Boxes, because we're not going back. I said, what do you? I saved everything, because they took everything away from me. So I bought an iron, I saved the box. I bought the sterilizer for the babies, I saved the box to take it back. And I said, why? Because we're now part of the Cold War, and nothing is going to happen. What we didn't know, and most of you didn't know, is that Castro wanted to put the bomb in New York. And it was Khrushchev that said, are you crazy?
We have a crazy guy.
They would destroy the island. He said, well, we need martyrs.
We know that now because when Russia fell in the files of the KGB and all that, that was there. So you were right to be hiding under the table. We almost caught it.
Like that was going to help any of us, right?
That's why we left for Maine for 2 years and then 2 years. No, when he said, I have to teach in college, I can't keep doing boy and marries the girl and Tommy's the boy.
Fascinating stuff.
So we came from Maine.
Yeah. That's excellent.
And we're glad you did.
Exactly, for sure.
Absolutely. And I can tell other stories about Dr. Hyde and Dr. Foley that are absolutely wonderful.
The next phase of this is where I embarrass some of my fellow classmates. For example, I wanted to ask Dory where she learned to drive.
I wasn't prepared for that, Dick.
I know.
In his backfield.
What kind of a vehicle was it?
No, I don't know.
It was an old 1940 Chevy with no fenders in the back.
That's right.
Right. And she learned to drive by grabbing the steering wheel, putting her foot on the gas, and the next thing I know, she's just heading right straight for the woods.
First experience.
Anybody else have a comment?
I've got a question.
Yes.
I'd like to address Roger a question. Do you remember the winter, 1955, you brought a horse up to Ken Genesis. We've been cutting wood, you and I and Elliot Blake. I took the horse for a ride, hadn't been out of the barn. The horse ran from all the way, I couldn't stop it, clear to the big rock. Road's just a sheet of ice. Last time I was ever on a horse. The horse got scared because I had my lunchbox slung over the saddle horn, and the thermos let go and started rattling. Coming down over the hill by Harold Glover's, horse is 4 feet, just like this. I'm going to have 2 broken legs. When he hit the flats, I thought he was doing at least 90 miles an hour.
That was Lammy.
Huh?
That horse's name was Lammy.
The horse stopped at the big rock. I slapped the horse on the butt. The horse took off and I walked.
I used to ride that horse and I did about a half a mile from the house. And then it would turn around and would go back home. It would start to gallop back home as fast as it could go.
Oh, it did.
And it would go up, and the barn was over here, and the horse would make a 90 at a full gallop right into the barn door, and I just keep going straight.
Ken Jennison mud season with his 29 Ford.
Yeah, that was the mud season.
Yes.
Right.
Snow tires and chains and 2x6s strapped on the roof. Good old days.
Anybody have any other comments before we wrap up here? Thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you, Mary Ann.
I just want to let everybody know, everybody often wonders where they can see this video since we've been videotaping tonight. They do play it on PBTV, and I know some of you can't get that or they don't have a regular schedule, so we do have little handouts at the back of the room. You can also watch it on a link to YouTube through our website. So if you have friends who couldn't make it tonight or people who no longer live in the Plymouth area and they'd like to see this video or other videos we have, you can take one of these and it tells you how to view them.